All right. Good morning, everybody. Um, so I recently I recently turned 30 last month, and I've been wanting to do a a kind of like pivotal reflection on my experiences. Um, Obviously this isn't gonna be obviously this video is not going to be, at least in my opinion, this video is not going to be a sweeping generalization of my life. It's just going to be more about, like, it's just going to be more about whatever I pick in this case. What I find important with kind of the things that I've noticed um, as I've gotten older. So this reflection is more going to be like, this is what I understand now as a 30-year-old man. So this can maybe be beneficial for some people. This can maybe be something like a kind of like case study, obviously, for people to be like, oh, he understands that as wisdom. But um, so I'm just gonna obviously I'm gonna start this video very not uh, there's no methodology to it, so I'm just gonna kind of just spit out what I immediately associate with my 30 years of kind of living. One immediate thing that I've kind of come across as a pivotal reflection in my own life is, at least when we talk about philosophy, is that I I am so against, like, a lot of these people. I don't even know how to phrase it because it's such a sweeping generalization. Basically, there are some people that do philosophy that are obsessed with trying to make these big systems. Now, I've met some people that do make these nice big systems of philosophy, um, and they typically understand the risks. These people that do philosophy, some of them, they typically understand the risk of making a kind of systems philosophy, whether it be an open system, a process philosophy, whatever the case. Um, they do make those kind of systems. But then there's people in that do philosophy that feel like they have to try to make a open system or a big system to essentially compete, um, to be relevant or to be significant for other people, to acknowledge their um, their intellect. um, and that's a very attractive position to be in, because when you first start like doing philosophy, when you start reading philosophy, let's just put that, when you start learning philosophy in any kind of way, at first you're pretty dependent upon the thinker that you're reading. Like, basically, a philosopher is always limited by his accumulation of philosophical tools and concepts. If you grant me a Deleuzian point, every every concept is a kind of like a tool, um, that you can use. So when you're reading philosophy and when you're thinking philosophy, you're limited by the tools that you have access to. So if you only read Plato, then you only have essentially Platonic tools. You have only Plato-esque tools. Now, there's obviously a benefit to this, and this is, you know, what I'm always gonna. This is what I learned is that you live only for so long. Okay, you live only for so long. You can choose, and this is what's ironic about life is that you can choose to just read Plato all you want. You can choose to read Plato all of your life. Now, what might be interesting now, if you did that, what might be interesting about you as a person is that you'd probably be one of the few people that I know. In fact, I don't. In fact, I know zero, but you'd be the first person that I would know that would have done that. And you would be a very interesting person to talk to just because you decided to spend all of your life reading Plato. Now, would I personally want to do that? No. Like I'm just not that attractive. Too attractive. Okay, I see my unconscious here. I'm just not that attracted to Plato, like at all. Um, I don't really find him attractive. Maybe that's what I was trying to say. Maybe it wasn't even about myself. And it's funny because actually Nietzsche does this big thing on Socrates. Like he says, like, oh, he's ugly. So therefore he does bad philosophy. If I recall, there's something on that. Like Nietzsche does like a really interesting take on that. But anyway, that's a side note. I always like Nietzsche just because he's so unapologetic with like just everything he does. He's just so unapologetic about it. Like you can tell Nietzsche embodied the whole like I don't give a fuck kind of vibes before that became like a thing to do. Like before it came cool to be like I don't give a fuck. Nietzsche, I feel like kind of had that that vibe. It's like I don't give a fuck, but I'm gonna tell you how I think it actually is. Um, so yeah, so you could read Plato all of your life, um, but again, you will run into that feeling that all philosophers run into, which is you can't possibly encounter every philosopher, and you can't possibly encounter every thought and idea. Where you will encounter these thoughts and ideas most of the time is through other people. So now this is the more difficult part because I recently had an experience with Hegel. Because how can I explain this? I'm a kind of philosopher that has this. I have like these intuitions. If you grant me to say the word intuition without necessarily defining it, um, I have these like intuitions, right? And when somebody says something, uh, my bell starts ringing. Now, what's difficult about when my bell rings as like a kind of like to indicate to me that there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with what was said, and it's not like an actual like you said something wrong, but it's more like the person said something, but fundamentally I feel like they're missing something. Like there's something being missed in that statement, and it begins to, in some ways, viscerally bother me because like I'm like trying to understand where it went wrong. Like where is the part that my intuition is telling me that this statement is missing something, or this person is missing a perspective? Because, and what's difficult about this kind of experience that I have as a philosopher is that typically I don't have the words to and I don't even have like the knowledge to even say sometimes what is possibly missing. Now, again, going back to my philosophy tools, with all that I have, and I don't have much to work on, but I have read thinkers that have helped me think through more complex issues, but I also like thinkers that I've read that have helped me think through more seemingly mundane and obvious, uh, you know, daily encounters. Which I'm more obsessed with the latter. I'm more obsessed with the more um, mundane and obvious encounters like that. For me, like that is where philosophy is the most like beautiful, you could say. It's the most attractive to me, like, and so I typically like to read thinkers that I can do this with. um, but anyways, what I'm trying to say is that you are typically going to run into people that explain to you a kind of thinker, and you have a couple of options, because obviously you can't spend so much of your life reading every single thinker. I mean, even if you could, you would only be able to read like maybe like one work of them from them, maybe even two for a couple if you like them a lot. But I would say the fun thing about philosophy is discovering a thinker that you actually like. And I've always enjoyed this experience because, you know, there's just there is something fun about encountering people that, in my opinion, are obsessed with certain thinkers. You know, um, like for me right now, it's Martin Buber and Kierkegaard. You know, like, and also I still always have a kind of love for Muhammad Iqbal, because I feel like he's probably similar to what Daniel Garner calls a counter enlightenment thinker. Like I think Muhammad Iqbal is the forgotten voice in some of like Islamic thinking. But I also think it would be a false statement to think that, because I've been kind of like indirectly present with some real um, and sincere process philosophy, like process Islamic philosophers. So I've been kind of like watching them a little bit, like from the distance, uh, and I've been definitely enjoying what they've been saying, and I think they're doing a wonderful job. So I feel like I'm not like in that realm anymore. I don't really want to be in that realm of thought anymore. I think I wanted to be in that realm of thought when I was a Muslim, but for me, again, I feel like what I've noticed with, and this is what's always difficult to, this is what's always difficult with philosophy, is that some people some people start already with defending their position. Like, how can I put this? Like, I was one of those people. Like, when I was in Afghanistan, I I read. Actually, when I think about it, man, I actually have read Muhammad Iqbal like probably like four times, at least the reconstruction of the song like four times. When I think about it, I actually have, because I forget that I read it on deployment, like on my Kindle, and I like understood very little of it, because Muhammad Iqbal was just like name dropping people. I mean, he name dropped Hegel, Bergson, Whitehead. I mean, when I keep thinking about Iqbal, I mean, he really had read, and obviously one of his favorites was Nietzsche. Um, he has like a little bit of an exposition about him, kind of like being mournful over Nietzsche, and how he also kind of just barely missed his timeline. Like he barely just missed Nietzsche's timeline. Um, and obviously that period of thinkers where Nietzsche is born um, and dies is like one of the favorite eras of like reading thinkers. There were so many thinkers, so many great thinkers came out of that era, which is kind of ironic because it's also the era of that. It's the era that soon leads to like World War One, World War Two, and so many great thinkers like were in that era or like right before that era or just like right a little bit before those events, and like so many great thinkers. Uh, but that's a that's a side point. Um, my main point is that you read. I it's such a libidinal feeling to find a thinker that you enjoy, and when you encounter other philosophers, you're going to see that they also have the same kind of tendency. Like they're very enthusiastic about certain thinkers. Now, they may not necessarily identify themselves as like for example, like it would be a little bit weird for somebody to call me like a Buberin, you know. But obviously, if people have been reading my work, you can tell that obviously Buber has had some influence on me. Um, and then, if you guys have been reading some of my more recent works, you could tell like Kierkegaard has been becoming slowly like a bigger influence. And then, Hegel recently had his influence as well. So there's always interesting things with philosophy, but fundamentally what I'm trying to say is that you're always going to be restricted to your philosophical repertoire. I like that word, so I'm gonna drop it. Adam Phillips says it a lot. He's like a Freudian psychoanalyst. Well, he used to be a psychoanalyst. He kind of retired, but he continues to write books, and they're very good. But yeah, you're sort of limited to your philosophical tools. So how do you grapple with that? That was actually a part of my own experience. Like, how do you grapple with the fact that you are limited by your own philosophical tools? And not only are you limited by your own philosophical tools, there's obviously the more natural tools, like you have like your, if you grant me the word cognition and, your sort of creative ability to think and be thoughtful. These are all factors that are being played in consideration. One of the biggest things that people are afraid of, like they're afraid, is that they're afraid to say something wrong. And they're also afraid to give a stance, give like a stance on something. And then they feel even more afraid to possibly change their stance on something. And this is something that I've experienced all of these steps when I started getting into philosophy. Like, I went through the stage of like I was timid, and I would just careful with my words. I wanted to say things that only people agreed with, and if they didn't agree with it, then I'd step back, and that's it basically. But really, in my opinion, after doing philosophy for a couple of years, uh, in my opinion, the whole point of philosophy, in some sense, is to take a stance. You do have to take a stance on something. Now, you can argue that you don't have to take a stance. You don't have to do anything, but already that's a kind of stance. Unfortunately, that is a stance. So if you're going to take a stance, then, take a stance. But I think over time, philosophy has kind of given me the confidence to, with my own thinking and with my own readings of certain thinkers. And that's actually what's very unique about people, like when you encounter them, and especially people that are like reading philosophy. If we put aside for a moment whether we judge them for reading it wrongly or misunderstanding, obviously there's a danger with misunderstanding, but then there's also kind of like a beauty with misunderstanding. The concept of misunderstanding is always like, it's it really is like a difficult thing to like pin down and be very firm on. It would be better to say something like, if you do feel like somebody is misunderstanding a thinker, um, it would be better to basically the whole point. And this is what's interesting about philosophy, and it's also what's beautiful, but it also may be something that's annoying for specific people. What's beautiful about philosophy in this case is that if you do feel like somebody misunderstands a thinker, the kind of rule of thumb is that you're supposed to have some type of arguments for why you take that stance, like why you give that reading. Now, it doesn't mean that your reading is wrong per se, but you do have to have some type of argument to say why you take that stance and why you feel like this stance is somewhat justified. So for me, that's the kind of point when we feel like other thinkers or other people that we encounter sort of misunderstand a thinker, right? Because again, what's really unique about people reading philosophy is that they have, everybody has like this very interesting take and read. And obviously there's so many factors that like affect us when we're reading. Some people are trying to specifically spot things, they're trying to specifically look for things, which in my opinion, if you're going into philosophy to criticize a specific thinker, like in some ways you're doing philosophy, but there is this ironic twist where you're doing philosophy wrong. Um, because philosophy, at least historically, was not based on criticizing other thinkers. It was not based on this. But what is a very philosophical thing is for you to take a stance and to say why you disagree with this thinker and why you think your argument is justified in what it is. Um, Obviously, the way people handle disagreements is a debate on manners and a debate on some type of ethics. You'll find that people disagree on whether there should be a kind of mannerisms for having a constructive dialogue. You'll find certain people disagree, and again, what's funny about this is that this disagreement is allowed to happen because you are doing philosophy. And if you're saying that there needs to be some type of like constructive dialogue, well, we're already thinking from the position that we're trying to do, which is philosophize, and constructing a kind of ethics to doing philosophy is already a philosophy. So you'll find that in in some cases that there are certain thinkers that have a philosophy against having a kind of mannerisms or a polite anything. And you have to understand that is a philosophy, and they ironically have some justification in that, because for you to disagree with that is already like you having a philosophical stance. Now, you can make that the primary stance if you want, you know. Um, but fundamentally, nah, it's a moot point. I think. I think over time, as you start thinking, I mean, it really depends who you are as a person. Um, and that's why I feel like if you're going to read a philosophy, you shouldn't read a thinker because you feel like, here's the danger. Here's like the danger with this all is like a lot of us get confused, especially earlier, like baby philosophers, um, like me. Like I remember at a certain point, I was confused because I didn't know, like, I didn't know like if I needed to just start like reading sequentially, like Plato, Aristotle, etc., or if I needed to just follow the crowd and sort of pick thinkers that everybody says is important. But the problem with that is that you're always going to find somebody that says their thinker is important for said and said reasons, right? And then you're going to find that when you feel like said and said thinker is important, you're going to find people disagree with you. They're going to be like, yeah, well, they did this, but they kind of missed this, and then, so on and so on. So you're always going to come across a kind of like disagreement. And that's why fundamentally, I feel like one of the mature moves of philosophy is to eventually take a stance. And then one of the other mature moves is to eventually change your stance. Change your stance on something. And I think for those that are beginning to do philosophy, they can find that maybe a little intimidating to, one, eventually take a stance, and then two, eventually change your stance. Obviously, you can't force this to happen, but I will say that this is something that naturally happens. Like, if you are willing to give yourself to the process, this is really something that naturally happens. If you are sincerely trying to do philosophy, in my opinion, again, this is what naturally happens. Like, everybody that is doing philosophy in a very sincere way, and not for some type of like sophist kind of illusion, um, you basically always end up finding a stance that you want to take, and you take it, and then over the course of time, whether it be long or short, you find yourself slowly changing that stance. Either kind of like changing it in such a way that you've refined your stance, or you've completely thrown away your stance. You come across several variations of this. Obviously, it's not a clear cut thing. Some people take parts of it and then throw the rest of it away. Some people throw all of it away. I mean, you'd be surprised. Like, I'm probably like one of the biggest people that, like, you could look at me and be like, all right, give him like 5 months and he will have a different position. Like, either I will either I will have a different position, or I will have thrown most of my original position away. You know, and that's what makes it difficult for me to. Uh, it makes it difficult for me to like stay in whatever stance that I'm in, because, for example, one of my recent big philosophical kind of investigations is my work on timing. And already like I haven't thought about it, but I started thinking about it, and already I feel like dismissing most of it, really, like dismissing most of the work. Obviously, there is still like a line of thread that makes the whole philosophy that I'm still keeping, but like everything that I used to previously explain timing, I'm kind of like, I started thinking about it more. I'm like, oh, I think I'm gonna throw this away. And this is what's funny is that um, I couldn't write Cadell's, uh, I couldn't write my Nietzsche paper on the phenomenology of tension because fundamentally, like this, like it led me to an entire whole reworking of something. Like I've found out that in my thinking on the phenomenology of tension was that one of the most important elements was timing. And I felt like I couldn't write the paper unless I investigated this issue. Um, and what's funny is that I'm still investigating the issue in some ways. It's been a little bit on pause, but I'm still investigating the issue. Um, but funny enough, me taking a break from it has helped me realize a lot of things. Um, but yeah, that's, I digress, right? The main point is that if you do sincere philosophy, you're going to eventually take a stance, and you're eventually also going to get rid of that stance or change it in a variety of ways. For example, I am notorious within my friendship circles to just like changing on the dime, like changing on the dime. Now, for certain people, that might be a kind of turn off. That might be interpreted as like a kind of like, I think in like what football, changing teams is like a very bad thing, right? So, you know, you could say like I'm a kind of like bandwagoner of philosophy or something. But it's funny because in philosophy, they actually encourage kind of bandwagoning, right? Like you go for whatever stance you think is good. Like, you don't stick with the stance that you don't think is good. Um, but of course, bandwagoning is the concept of, well, you go with the stance that everybody thinks is good. But the funny thing about philosophy is that the stance that everybody's trying to take is the stance that is good. So in some sense, there is a kind of like bandwagoning because we're all trying to think about truth, goodness, everything, life, and its problems, and so on. So you can see why there is a kind of like bandwagoning in philosophy, but it's not a bad bandwagoning. It's a bandwagoning that is a given because we're all trying to go for truth and be as concrete as we can. Um, so, that's why it's kind of funny, like saying the term bandwagoning in philosophy, because it's like, I think philosophy would be like, yeah, like we're all trying to grab a good stance. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to stick to a team for a long time, you know. Um, in fact, you probably might get a little bit funny looks if you stay dogmatically Kantian all the rest of your life. Though you would be a definitely interesting person to talk to if you were, because obviously that means that you have a very interesting understanding of Kant, and probably more time spent on Kant than most people are willing to spend. So it wouldn't go to waste at all. Like there is definitely benefits to just being like just one dogmatic thinker on a specific person, because we can bear the fruits of your labor by just encountering you. Right now we can completely disagree with you, but what I've what I've noticed, and this is something very interesting, is that if you choose to dedicate your life to a specific thinker, um, you're just like a very interesting person to encounter. Like, like I can't imagine encountering somebody that's like only read Plato, like, but they've read all of Plato, and they've read it over and over again. Like that would be a really interesting person to talk to, because obviously most of us talk about Plato, but we don't spend most of our lives rereading Plato, thinking Plato again. We sort of just like move on, right? So there is a benefit and beauty to that. And that's something that you have to decide as a thinker for yourself, whether you want to dedicate your time in thinking. It's not a waste. It's not a waste at all to dedicate your time to a complete thinker. You know, um, One of the things that I struggled with, right, is this fear, and this is, you would think this is a sort of like personal fear, but it is kind of like a more general fear that philosophers kind of have, because you can kind of tell that they all have it a little bit, where it's like you're afraid that you're going to miss something. Now, that missing something is interpreted in a variety of ways, but fundamentally, it kind of comes down to either you feel like you might have wasted some time with, just reading Plato all of your life. But then you also feel like you wasted some time if you went from sequential, like every sequential thinker, right? From like Plato to Hegel or whatever, right? Because if you think about it, well, most likely if you're doing some sequential take, you've probably only spent reading one or two books from every thinker that you have been doing. And of course, there's always this question of, this haunting back question of the back of your mind is, did you really understand that thinker when you read him for the first time? Of course, the answer is no. In fact, you're always going to discover that when you read them a second time, a third time, a fourth time, you're going to be like, wow, I didn't understand it the second time. I didn't understand it the third time. I didn't understand it the fourth time. I think I've read Hegel's introduction probably at least 5 times, because I'm like, every time I'm like, okay, I'm going to read him. I'm going to finish him, right? I'm going to read him. I'm going to finish him. Finally, I'm probably like the fourth reading of the introduction. I go, oh, I don't even have to read the rest of the book. Like, what kind of bizarre conclusion did I reach to understand that? But I did, and I justified my arguments for doing so. Because I felt like Hegel actually gave me the room to do this. Believe it or not, he actually gave me the room to argue that I didn't have to read the rest of this. But yeah, the main point that I'm trying to get at is you're not gonna understand thinkers. But what is interesting about your own reading is that it's your own reading. And a lot of people get timid and afraid over their own reading of a thinker. And they always feel like a little less confident. I mean, I recently did a video on Hegel, okay? Of course, you can't be timid doing this, because I can imagine, a kind of guy that just started doing philosophy, he might be a little bit timid to say something about Hegel, because he'll be like, well, there's so many people that have spent time with Hegel, so many people that have read Hegel, um, that they don't want to say the wrong thing, because obviously there's people with experience, and you feel afraid because there's this gap in experience, but there's always going to be a gap in experience. Now, what's interesting about the beginner stance is that you have an opportunity to say something interesting. Now, people may disagree, and that's fine. That's a value judgment on that reading. But interesting, right? Like, for me, interesting, like if somebody gives like an interesting stance on something, like that is priceless in my opinion. Um, and for me, that's like the most important point, like giving a interesting take, because that is obviously not a reading that you can encounter just on your own, and that is not a reading that you can always technically read in books. So just talking to people and sharing an interesting take. Now, I want to preface this because I'm afraid some people will interpret this like, oh, let me try to give an interesting reading. I would be careful of those intentions, only because if you try to give an interesting reading, and this is the ironic take on this, is that you might end up giving the most bland reading. Okay, and it it just has to do with paradoxical intentions. Like Viktor Frankl talks about this. Actually, it has to do with hyper intentionality. Like the more you're intentful on doing something, the more you obscure that goal from itself. So I would say you shouldn't try to give a interesting reading like purposely, but what I'm trying to say is if you share your reading, if you share your understanding, the byproduct of that sharing may be an interesting take. That's all I'm saying. You don't actually have to actively give an interesting take on something. With and the same thing with, like, you don't actually have to try to give a good response. You just have to give a response. And that may be a good response. And that may be an interesting response, but fundamentally, one of the rule thumbs of philosophy, the ruling thumb on this, is that you have to risk something. And so it doesn't matter how little you've read, doesn't matter how little you understand, you have the capacity for an interesting take, and you have a capacity for an interesting stance. And I've noticed this throughout my years of doing philosophy, and I haven't been doing it even for 10 years, but I've been doing it for at least what, five-ish years, maybe four. um, Probably three for serious time. But, you know, you, you, you get what I'm saying. Like, this is something that over time you will realize, hopefully you will realize. And but because this is something that I realized over time too. It's like the people that are previously or seemingly intimidating because of their wealth of knowledge. I mean, absolutely, they should be respected, and they should be their thoughts should be heard. You shouldn't dismiss them immediately, like as if you know. Um, but what I'm trying to say is that they shouldn't be intimidating figures to engage with. You have to think about the goal here. The goal here is that everybody finds a problem that they think is important. Now, what gets even more interesting is that you will encounter people in your life that show your framing of your question isn't correct, or maybe problematic. Like there may be a deeper question in this. And that, again, that leads you to wonderful explorations. Now, there's something that isn't taught in philosophy too much. And one of the things that isn't taught in philosophy is to how to handle criticism, how to handle disagreements. And obviously, the reason why this isn't a topic too much of debate is because fundamentally, by me even saying this is already promoting a kind of philosophy. So my previous talk on this right here, what I said earlier in this video, is still true, right? Like there's no like dogmatic philosophy on this, because uh, you it's a philosophy, so somebody doesn't have to be, so to speak, respectful. They can hurt your feelings if they want to, because that is a kind of philosophy. Now, obviously, we can argue back and forth about why that's wrong and why, and then there you go, you're already doing it. But what I'm trying to say is that I've noticed that there is some philosophers that start doing philosophy and they're sort of stunned with the lack of a kind of manner or kind of behavioral respect for what is being said, right? And this and this is always going to be a problem. And my main point is that you cannot change how they respond to you. But what I'm saying is, if you are one of those people that find it problematic when others, in discussing philosophy, say things that are just off the grid, and you feel like they have no respect and no whatever. Um, if you are one of those people, then I guess what I'm trying to say is like this advice is for you then. Um, so like understand that when an idea like when an idea is being dismissed, try your best to understand the argument and just subtract all of the anecdotal informations that are said in between it all. Just try to focus like on the argument and think about it. Now, what's fascinating about philosophy and what I've learned in my own experience is I've always been very fascinated by this specific experience, and it's this. I'm always surprised on how there's specific things that people say that it doesn't matter what they say. Like, I mean, well, actually, that might be true. Sometimes it's not all the time. It's what they say, but sometimes it's what is said that I just find disagreeable. But sometimes what is initially kind of disagreeable, or at least kind of feels disagreeable, ends up being like a realization for you. Um, and I can't make sense of this experience because it's always interesting to me for a couple of reasons. And one of those are like, how come people say specific arguments or take specific stances, that when it's expressed, right? One, I either stay disagreeing with what they just explained to me, or when they explain it, I kind of go, oh, okay. And I've always been like the reason why this interaction specifically is interesting is because you're left with a couple of questions. Did you really change your mind, or did you realize that what the person was saying is actually close to your position, right? And that's something that always haunts me because it can give you the illusion, or you can possibly fall into the illusion of, oh, I realized something and I made like a kind of like growth realization or something. But I mean, obviously, there's room to argue for the fact of like having this realization may be a kind of like growth, because obviously now you can see that you and the other person that you previously disagreed with actually agreed. Um, but again, this experience of discovering how you initially disagree with somebody, but then realize that it's not really a disagreement, they've actually revealed something to you, um, a different understanding or a different view of the take, and then you're like, oh, I I kind of agree with that. So agreement as like a kind of agreement and disagreement is always interesting, and there's always a danger to wanting to agree, and there's always a danger to fervently disagreeing. Um, and that's why I feel like a lot of, in my opinion, the point of philosophy is to, not necessarily give all these complex systems and solve all of metaphysics and everything else. I think a lot of people don't really think about this. I mean, obviously it's very easy to get enthusiastic and want to do a whole metaphysics and do a whole thing. Uh, if you truly have the capacity for it, I mean, do it. But if you're doing it because you want to feel like seen as a thinker, then I can't stress this enough. Don't do it. Just don't do it. I'm one of those thinkers that's like, think in your realm, discover your limitations as a thinker, and just think in that. Um, and of course, the irony of it all, if you do think within those realms of discovering your limitations, then ironically, you surpass your own limited cognitive abilities and so on, and your own thinking. Like, but you have to really kind of just start where you are. Um, you know, and I'm not guilt free from this. I think I initially came in excited. I wanted to think the biggest things possible. But now, as I've gotten older, um, I've I have no drive for thinking a huge system. Now, this is what's beautiful about philosophy. Somebody can use some of your insights and some of your work as some of the grounding foundations for a big system, right? And to me, that's always complimentary, and it's nice. So what I'm trying to say is you don't have to think big. You don't have to think big. You can think small. You can think immediate. You can think through some of the most troubling problems that frustrate you, that you've always kind of wanted to explore and understand. You know, you don't have to think these big topics like metaphysics. Of course, these topics are important. I'm not trying to say that they're not important, but I am trying to say that there is something about you as an individual who wants to do philosophy. Um, what I'm trying to say is that you can contribute in some way. Everybody has the capacity to contribute in some way. But here's the beautiful and horrifying thing of it all: you have to explore and tread that journey for yourself. Like, you have to figure out, like, what is it that is important to you as a thinker, and you have to figure out what you want to fundamentally think about, or remedy or solve. I hate the word solve because I have such a you know I have such a big problem with solve, but I don't have another word. So because solve means there's a kind of solution. Um, but anyways, yes, the main point is discovering those things, and like I said before, taking a stance. Um, Now, some of those people might be like, well, I don't want to take a stance if I'm going to eventually change it. But that's kind of the whole point. Like, that really is the whole point. Like, you grow as a philosopher for this exact reason, taking a stance and eventually changing it. And it's daunting. It may be scary to do this because you would be like, that mean I was wrong. That would mean that I didn't think correctly. I missed something. Well, bad news, you're always going to miss something and you're always going to misunderstand something because misunderstanding is sort of omnipresent in philosophy. you know, um, even the people that say, even the people that tell you you need to understand so and so better, they have a misunderstanding. Like they just feel like they don't have it. But they just feel like they have a better understanding than you. Okay. But yes. So this can be scary as a beginning philosopher to take a stance, eventually leave it, and discover something new. Um, but for me, that's the maturity aspect of it all. Um, so that's why I don't have any desire to think metaphysics. Now, people can say like, well, you are already thinking a kind of metaphysics and so on. Of course, you are. But fundamentally, if you're going to be a philosopher, then discover where you are in your position and think within the realms that allow you to think. Um, you don't have to think big. If there's any message in this video, it's you don't have to think big. Um, I think so many people come in so enthusiastic. They want to solve all the problems of philosophy. They want to talk about the free will debate, and they want to think through um, these certain things. But if you're this is gonna sound like cheesy, but if your heart's not really in that problem, then that's not the problem for you. you know. Um, but if you find a problem that you are sort of passionate for, um, and you feel really passionate about it, then you have to uh, think about it. You know, you can read thinkers, you can read specific thinkers if you want to think about a specific problem. That's also very useful. Um, because that will actually help you make a choice. If you have a specific problem and you want to think about, uh, like if you want to think about the problem of love, uh, there's specific thinkers that talk about love and they really think about it. So if you feel like love is a philosophical problem, obviously it is. Uh, you can pick those thinkers. Like for example, Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard has some wonderful expositions on love. Um, Nietzsche has some interesting takes on love. Um, there's a lot of thinkers that have interesting takes on love, and if that's a problem that you want to explore, then those are the thinkers that you have to read. Um, but of course, what's a little bit problematic about picking a specific problem is that you may discover that you're not as passionate for that problem. So that's why I always say try to pick a problem that you are passionate for and you do enjoy. Um, you do genuinely feel like you want to solve because it's so apparent and so real in your life. It's so visceral. Um, and again, a lot of the things that I talk about are these exact things. Like for me, when I bring up an issue, is because I feel like it's important because I'm dealing with it. Can you say that's a kind of like point of bias or point of privilege? Yeah, absolutely. But if you're not doing philosophy for your life, then what are you doing philosophy for? Because you're not going to convince anybody um, about your positions. So what do you do? Well, you have to think for yourself. You have to think what you want to solve and what are the biggest problems in your life that have philosophical significance. And there you go. You can narrow down and choose thinkers based off of those problems. Um, and so this is why, everybody, you'll soon discover that everybody has a kind of philosophical project. Like they have something they want to solve, they have something they want to think about. Um, it's so important to them. And I go through these stages all the time where I feel like a specific problem is super important, and I feel like we got to talk about it. you know, like for me right now, it's onto epistemology, it's anxiety, it's grind culture. They're all linked to each other, which is why this is the work I want to do. Um, but like also, yeah. So I've been doing some work on anxiety through Kierkegaard, obviously, but we'll see how deep I want to go. How deep do I want to go on this? Um, and if you drop the problem, if you feel like that's not a problem that you want to think about anymore too much, then you're free to do so. That's the beauty of it all. So I wouldn't dog yourself on that. But anyways, I just hit an hour, so I'm going to cut the video. Um, there's still clearly a lot of things to share in my 30 years of living. But mainly the point of this video was to share where my thoughts are now and sort of the advice I would give from the standpoint of where I am now. Um, there's still clearly a lot of things to share, but because I'm already at an hour, and I decided to talk about some philosophical interactions between other philosophers because I think it's really important. And for some reason, I decided to do a big portion of this video on like, how can beginners approach philosophy and like some of the traps that we all fall into with reading philosophy. Uh, how do we handle criticism? How do we deal with changing a position? How do we deal with eventually taking a risk to take a stance on a specific position? How do we deal with this interaction of the fact that you may always disagree with people, and then there may be people in your life that help you realize something. I'm more impressed with the fact of there's people that I just continue to disagree with, or I'm more attractive. I'm more attracted to the idea of we have the same goal, like we have the same vision, right? But we disagree on the method to get there, or we disagree like how to get there. That's actually probably going to be the most common disagreement, believe it or not. And those disagreements are probably the most visceral because you are passionate about that goal, and so is the other guy. He's just as passionate about that vision. Um, and how do you deal with that? Right? How do you deal with that conflict? That is something that isn't really talked about too much because you know if you study some of the history of philosophy, these are the most crazy interactions. Like they're the most brutal. Like they're the most brutal back and forth because they both have that same vision, but they just fundamentally disagree on how to get there. And it's such a like, just like two bulls just going at each other. Um, and this, obviously, in my opinion, most of these cases, there is no agreement. And how do you deal with that? Well, in my opinion, you do what you think is best. There is just nothing else that you can do. The best thing you can do is try to understand their position as much as you can. Of course, there is a limit to that understanding because if they're coming from a background of different thinkers that you haven't uh, had before, then you have a couple options. Either you decide for yourself to go into the thinkers they've read to understand their position, or you can realize that obviously I would have to spend a lot of my time and a lot of my life to reading their thinkers, that I don't want to do that. Um, and so you're stuck at this standstill. But I just want to let you know that even if you do take that latter position, it's okay. Like, fundamentally, you should read thinkers that you enjoy. Fundamentally, because I can tell you right now, reading a thinker that you don't off the bat find attractive to your thought, um, it's dangerous, because you risk you are probably the person that is most likely to distort the thinker, just because you are actively looking for something within the thinker's works. Now, I don't want to say that this is always bad, because sometimes, even if you have the intent on reading a thinker and just like destroying them, just so you can make your argument back to the other guy that disagreed with you, what you might end up discovering is you might discover that the thinker says something and you're like, oh, that's interesting. So actually, the person that I disagreed with, his reading of this is like not the same as mine. Like, I understand it so differently. And so then you may not even have like a visceral disagreement about the thinker, but you may have just now you may have just a disagreement about the reading. Um, but what I'm trying to say is, for the most part, don't go in trying to read a thinker to um, rebuttal something like that. That is not the intention. We should try to not make that the intention. Um, if you are going to read a thinker, try to do it in honest approach. You would be, trust me, from my own experience, you would be surprised about how thinkers, believe it or not, like when I first read just like a little bit of Kant on reason, I was so impressed. Like, I was so impressed. There was something that Kant, Kant, you can tell he was so inspired, and even though people disagree with him, I mean, there is something attractive about Kant, because obviously he's one of those giants. Um, Obviously, he's one of those giants that we feel like he's wrong, but and that's room for disagreement too. But when I read Kant, I was so captured by his sort of passion for an issue. Um, and the same thing with Hegel. If you read the introduction, there is a kind of like passion, and I've always been attracted to thinkers that have like a kind of passion in what they're saying. Even if you disagree with what they're saying, they have like this passion for it, and it's always attractive to me. Nietzsche's, you know, if you want to be inspired, read Nietzsche. Nietzsche has, um, he doesn't have like a coherent system. You can try to make a coherent system out of Nietzsche, but he's not really like a system philosopher. Which is why I like him, because he's such a passionate dude. And the same thing with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's such a passionate dude. Oh my God. How many times have we wished Nietzsche would have read Kierkegaard? Um, I mean, honestly, I wish they would have just met each other. I can't imagine, can't even fathom what they would have constructed out of their meeting from each other. Um, it would have been such a crazy, uh, contribute to philosophy. But they both contribute something to philosophy very strongly. So I'm going to stop there. Obviously, there's still a lot of experiences and wisdoms to share from from my own experience. This is just from my own experience. But yeah. All right, guys, take care. Bye.